Good evening and welcome to the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. I'm Steve Nolt, the Young Center Director, and delighted that each of you is here with us this evening. This evening, we are gathered for our annual Kreider Lecture, presented this evening by Rose Fisher, this year's Kreider Fellow. I'll introduce Rose in a moment, but want to acknowledge Ken and Carol Kreider, who are here with us this evening for endowing the Kreider Fellowship and Kreider Lecture, which annually brings scholars to the Young Center to deepen our understanding of Anabaptist and Pietist traditions in all their ways. So thanks very much to the Kreiders for supporting the Young Center and Elizabethtown College in this way. Before we move into our lecture this evening, I wanted to take a moment to announce the 2024 Dale Brown Book Award winner. Often I announce the Dale Brown Book Award winner at the Durnball lecture, but this year our judges were, they only just a few days ago completed their thoughtful consideration of the many fine titles that had been nominated this year. And so this year, selected from works published in the last 3 years, the unanimous choice of our independent evaluators was Royden Lowen's book, Mennonite Farmers, A Global History of Place and Sustainability. And we look forward to having Roy with us sometime next school year to talk about his book. Roy has actually just recently retired, but as a professor of history at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, he is an accomplished historian. He also is a farmer himself, farming a family farm in southern Manitoba with his brother and son. And he told me last week that now that he has retired, this year is the first year that he's not only working the farm in the summer, but is sort of working year round in that endeavor. This book is a fascinating 7-country comparison, a truly global study, a 7-country comparison of Mennonite, Old Colony Mennonite, and Brethren in Christ farmers, farming practices, and farming communities in Canada, the United States, Bolivia, the Netherlands, Russia, Zimbabwe, and Indonesia. The study was conceived, designed, and written by Lowen, but he relied on numerous translators and interpreters as he worked in a variety of national contexts in which he didn't speak the language. And the central place of language brings us to our topic tonight. Wasn't that a just great way I segued into from this book to our topic this evening, the central place of language. This evening, we look at the interplay of language and identity in the lives of Lancaster County's Amish and Old Order Mennonites, considering how English and Pennsylvania Dutch are used in contrast to one another and in complementary ways, and to the extent in which each functions in certain domains, such as the home or the work setting. And our guide in this investigation is Rose Fisher. Rose is a Ph.D. student at Penn State University, a student in German linguistics with a research focus on Pennsylvania Dutch. During her time this semester as the Young Center's Kreider Fellow, she has been, among other things, visiting with and interviewing Amish and Old Order Mennonite folks, collecting data for her dissertation. As a former member of the Amish community and as a linguist, Fisher is interested in promoting the Pennsylvania Dutch language by better understanding its grammar, how it interacts with English, and the ways that the rich culture of these Anabaptist communities shape the language over time. She is a graduate of Millersville University. She spent a semester in 2017 at the University of Würzburg in Germany, and then spent the 2022-23 academic year in Marburg, Germany. She is a native Pennsylvania Dutch speaker, an advanced German speaker, and an intermediate Spanish speaker, and tonight she will be speaking to us in English with her presentation, Language Patterns Among Lancaster County Anabaptists. Do Amish and Old Order Mennonites use English and Pennsylvania Dutch differently? Welcome, Rose.
Well, can everybody hear me okay? I just want to start by saying it's a huge honor. Okay, thank you. It's a huge honor to talk to you guys tonight about one of my favorite topics, Pennsylvania Dutch. So thank you very much for coming. So I want to start by giving you just kind of a roadmap of what this lecture will look like. I'm going to start by talking about my background, which is how I ended up interested in this topic and studying this topic. I'm also going to talk a little bit about linguistics, what it is, why we should care about it. And then I will introduce Pennsylvania Dutch, which may need no introduction for many of you, but hopefully you'll still learn something new. And then I will talk about grammatical gender, which is the grammatical topic of my dissertation. And I look at how grammatical gender is marked on articles, adjectives, and pronouns in Pennsylvania Dutch. So first, starting with my background, many of you may already know, I was born right here in Lancaster County into an Amish family, and I am the one circled in these what I think not objectively are adorable pictures of my family when we were still Amish. So my parents left the Amish in 2007 when I was 11, which is how I got the opportunity to pursue higher education, study German and linguistics, and end up here talking to all of you guys. And that's also how I ended up a native Pennsylvania Dutch speaker and interested in the language. But I'm not only interested in Pennsylvania Dutch, as Steve pointed out, I have also always loved languages. And this is what got me interested in the study of linguistics. So what is linguistics, you might be wondering? I would define it as the study of the structure of language. And by that, I mean the rules that we follow that allow us to communicate meaning when we speak to each other. So there are a lot of subfields of linguistics, and they include phonetics, which is the study of sounds. So how your vocal tract can form different sounds, how we differentiate sounds. You have phonology, which is how different sounds can combine. So for example, in English, you can use BR to start a word like brown, but you can't start a word with RB. That's a rule of English and many other languages. Morphology is the study of how words are formed using different parts, and syntax is the study of how you string words together into a sentence. Semantics is the study of the meaning of words, and pragmatics is more about context. So the members of a conversation, who you're talking to, things like that. So language study can be very complicated, is the moral of that story. So why does linguistics matter? I've compiled a list of reasons why I think linguistics matter and why I think everyone should care about language studies. So first of all, understanding linguistics or language is crucial for understanding what makes humans different than animals, because humans can use language to communicate and animals cannot. And understanding language also tells us a lot about how our brains work, because we can do all of these things unconsciously that are really complex with language without really having any understanding of how we're doing that, both understanding and producing language. Understanding language is also just one demonstration of how fearfully and wonderfully made we are. And lastly, if we have a better understanding of how language works, my hope is that we can do a better job of appreciating and maintaining the languages that we have, whether that's speaking more than one language, learning another one, or just appreciating that someone else talks a little differently than you. So to give you some examples of what we do in linguistics, I have some examples from English of how we might use linguistics to understand speech and language. First of all, I'll address this question to you. How many vowels do you think English has? Does anyone have a guess or think they know?
6, 7.
6, 7. Those are the guesses. Anyone want to go higher? 15. And I point this out because this kind of demonstrates that our spelling system, which lets us write out 5, does not give us very much information about how many different sounds we actually produce. So as linguists, we can use the IPA, which is the International Phonetic Alphabet, to write out the sounds that people actually say. So I have a list of examples from English of how terrible the English spelling system is and how something like OUGH can have so many different sounds. So this here is an example of the IPA, and that's how you would write though, which is one way of saying OUGH. Another way is through or oo. Another one is all in thought. Another one is in thorough. And another one is in tough. Those are all different vowels. This last example is the same as the one in thought, cough, but you can see that the GH gives you the F sometimes and sometimes not. So moral of the story is we need the IPA because English spelling fails us miserably. So this is also just to point out that linguists don't really care very much about orthography, which is the official spelling system. We care about the sounds that people actually make. My next example is from morphology, which is plurals is an example, marking plural is an example of morphology. So I have this really classic example from Jean Berko Gleason. We have here a little wug, and now we have two of them. There are two, does anyone want to fill in the blank? There are two wugs. Okay, how did you know that? You never saw this word before, right? Okay, add S, right? Yeah, everyone learned to add S. Okay, what about Gutch? How would you say more, now there are two? That would be a Pennsylvania Dutch example. I think most English speakers would probably not do get, but I love that you said that. Yeah.
Gutches.
Gutches. Mm-hmm. Right. It has to be gutches. Okay. So again, you've never seen these words before, but you have a clear impression of what the plural should be. And it's beyond just S. Why would you say is for Gutch? It's because S is actually very hard to combine with the ch sound. So you put a little vowel in there to make it easier to say. But it's more complicated than that. Plural S in English actually has three different ways of saying it. There is S, Z, and is. So I explained why we get is. The difference between S and Z is when the word ends in a consonant that doesn't use your vocal cords, which T does not. So if you put your fingers here and you go you won't feel your vocal cords vibrate. Or so both S and T don't make your vocal cords vibrate, they match. G and Z do make your vocal cords vibrate. So if you go Z, you should feel your vocal cords vibrate. That's the rule for English plural, which you probably never learned in school. And I'm using that to point out that just because a grammar rule is not written down in a textbook of English does not mean it's not a legitimate rule that every speaker can follow. So that's just kind of trying to dispel the myth that something needs to be written or in a grammar book for it to be legitimate. This next example is about double negatives, which are kind of famous for being wrong, right? You shouldn't use double negatives. I think we probably all learned that in school. Just a disclaimer, this is a little bit of an oversimplified explanation of this phenomenon, but I think it serves my purposes really well. So I have these two sentences, he don't eat no cake, and he never doesn't eat cake. They're both double negatives. And now I want to know what you think. Okay, so we've all heard two negatives make a positive, right? Does that hold true for these sentences? So if we look at he don't eat no cake, do we get a positive reading, as in he eats cake, or a negative reading, as in he does not eat cake? Who thinks it's positive? Nobody. Who thinks it's negative? Okay, but you guys don't use double negatives, right? But you understood it, okay? What about the next one? Who thinks it's positive? He never doesn't eat cake. Negative? Positive, right? Okay. So my point is, even if it's ungrammatical, there's a grammar. You can tell the difference between these two sentences. It's not just all two negatives make a positive. So what is the rule here? The rule, oversimplified admittedly, is that int first means negative and int second means positive. So these are the kinds of things that we care about in linguistics, aside from what people think they should be saying. We care about what people say. Right, and we don't really care about what all the grammar police care about correctness. Okay, so that was my little linguistics demonstration. I'm going to switch over to talking about Pennsylvania Dutch and give you a little bit of a background where it came from, starting with where the speakers came from, the speakers who became the Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. So the focal points of the Anabaptist movement throughout the 15 and 1600s were Switzerland and the Netherlands, but the people who became the Pennsylvania Dutch speakers came primarily from Switzerland, which is why I have a map of Switzerland here. And so these speakers, the Anabaptists who were experiencing a lot of persecution in Switzerland, ended up moving either north into the Palatinate, which is what we're seeing here. Oh my, that's not what I meant to do. So So here they're moving north into the Palatinate, and this is the state of the Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany, or they moved west into Alsace. So here we have them moving west into Alsace. This is a map of Europe. This is Germany, France, and Alsace right between Germany and France. So they went into those two places, and from there moved on into Pennsylvania, and from Pennsylvania spread into the Midwest and elsewhere. But that's where they started. So what is often misunderstood about Pennsylvania Dutch is people think it's more related to Netherlands Dutch, but it is actually a German variety. And it is most similar to many Southern German dialects like Swiss German spoken in Switzerland and Alsatian German spoken in the Alsace. Okay, makes sense from what we've just heard. But it's most closely related actually to Palatine German, which is spoken right here in the Palatinate. And that's just because most of the immigrants ended up coming out of that region into Pennsylvania. The language formed in Pennsylvania in the 1700s. Here on this map of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers from 2001, we can see that Pennsylvania is the hotspot, but it has spread out from there. And it now has its own group and region-based dialects. So, for example, the Amish here in Lancaster speak differently than the Amish in the Midwest. The Amish here in Lancaster also speak different than the Mennonites here in Lancaster, as many of us are well familiar with. So who does actually speak or who spoke Pennsylvania Dutch? I mention this because at least growing up, I wasn't aware of this. I know that a lot of people from an Amish background aren't always aware of this. German Reformed and Lutheran immigrants from German-speaking Europe actually historically made up the vast majority of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. So about 200 years ago, Pennsylvania was just loaded with Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, and most of them were not Anabaptists. The Anabaptists accounted for only about 5% of the original immigrant group. But because this group doesn't really use Pennsylvania Dutch for daily communication anymore, the Anabaptists are now, especially the more conservative Anabaptists, now make up the vast majority of modern day speakers. So if we look at these statistics from our very own Young Center, we can see that there are Amish and Mennonites in the US, Canada, and even a few in South America, a few Amish at least. And on this map of the Amish in the United States, we can see that they're really all over the country, but the most concentrated in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, with the largest settlement right here in Lancaster County. Oh, yeah. So that brings us to that there are well over 400,000 speakers in total, and rapidly growing because the birth rate is high, and as is the retention rate, which means a lot of people who are born Amish and Mennonite stay Amish and Mennonite and pass the language on to their children. So one of the fastest growing languages in the world, famously. I want to also just touch on really quick, is Pennsylvania Dutch a language or a dialect? This is a bit of a debate. There aren't really official criteria for what the difference is between a language and a dialect, but like Mark Loudon, who wrote this really wonderful book that you should buy from the Young Center if you have not yet read it, I prefer to call it a language. And this is because the context of this German variety is and has always been American. It's been separated from continental European German for its entire history, and it is influenced in English, obviously, in ways that European German is not, and not influenced by Standard German in ways that European German varieties are. So I really think it's just, it's its own entity. It doesn't really fit into the broader German family as a dialect, I would argue. It's also not mutually intelligible with many, if not all, other German dialects, I would say. That depends on who you ask a little bit. Mutually intelligible is a fancy way of saying the two people can understand each other. So when my family visited me last year in Germany, they couldn't really just speak Pennsylvania Dutch and have no problem talking to the Germans, including in the Palatinate. I think there they got further and could say more with the people, but it wasn't flawless communication. So for that reason, too, I think it's really a separate thing. And Pennsylvania Dutch also has mutually intelligible dialects of its own, which I've already mentioned. So speakers of these dialects can understand each other. I just have this cute little example of a movie called Rumspringa that was made and filmed in Germany. As you might imagine, it's written with pretty bad myths and stereotypes about the Amish. Not bad, but just untrue. But what I think is interesting is that it portrays this young Amish man going to Berlin on Rumspringa, which would never happen, but also that he can understand and speak perfectly with people in Berlin, which is very far from the Palatinate, and they speak a very different kind of German. So really unrealistic. Just to kind of further make my point that these aren't the same thing. So that brings me to my next point. Why does Pennsylvania Dutch matter? Isn't it just some broken mishmash of German and English, which is something it takes a lot of heat for being? And I would like to say resoundingly, no, it's not that. Pennsylvania Dutch is fascinating precisely because it has so successfully resisted the influence of English and maintained so much of its Germanness. So it's actually one of the immigrant languages in the US that's been here the longest and continues to be passed on to the next generation without new immigrants to kind of revive it. And so that makes it very remarkable. And it still has a lot of its original German features. It's not just some language you can use willy-nilly however you feel like. It's a complete language that has its own set of grammatical rules, whether that's for how sounds can combine, how words are built, or how words are strung together to make sentences. It doesn't matter that these rules aren't written down or explicitly taught, although actually they are written down in grammar books. It just might be that a lot of people don't know about them. And it also doesn't matter that most people don't write it. So I find that some people think because Pennsylvania Dutch isn't written, it's not a legitimate language, but actually most languages in the world are not written. And so that does not play a role in its legitimacy. And actually, even just to speak to each other, we have to follow grammatical rules or we're just going to be speaking and hearing gibberish. It is true that English has had a profound influence on Pennsylvania Dutch, and Pennsylvania Dutch has also had a very strong influence on the local English variety wherever it's spoken. Languages come into contact all the time, and they inevitably influence each other when they do. This is not surprising. It's not new. It happens everywhere where more than one language comes into contact with each other, and it doesn't make the language less complete. So one of my favorite examples is that English is loaded with French loanwords that you probably don't even know come from French. And it doesn't make English any less able to, let you say what you want to say just because that word sometime back when came from French. Yeah.
One thing that I heard just.
Oh, yeah. So I have one last linguistic example from Pennsylvania Dutch, actually. It's no secret that modern Pennsylvania Dutch borrows a lot of words from English. This is undeniable. But what happens when it borrows verbs like to teach or to avoid? I have an example here. Ich gleich teache. I like to teach. You cannot say ich gleich teach. That sounds terrible. I think my Pennsylvania Dutch speakers would agree with me. And the same is true. Sie set sail avoide. She should avoid that. You can't say sie set sail avoid. What's the rule? The rule is that Pennsylvania Dutch verbs in their base form, which is to teach or just teach in English, have to have this sound at the end. So actually, even when we borrow a word from English into Pennsylvania Dutch, it has to follow Pennsylvania Dutch grammar rules. You can't just do whatever you want with the language. You have to follow the rules. Okay, so that brings me to the topic of my dissertation, which is grammatical gender. If any of you have learned Standard German, you're already familiar with this. If you're not, lucky you. So basically, these examples are from Standard German. So we have der Wein and der Tisch. The wine and the table, they're masculine, so you would refer to those objects as he. Then you have die Tür, which is feminine for the door, and you would refer to it as a she. And you have das Messer, which is neuter, that you would refer to as it. So basically, grammatical gender is a way that some languages use to categorize nouns, in the case of German or Pennsylvania Dutch, into masculine, feminine, and neuter. It's related to biological sex or natural gender, but not exactly the same thing in the sense that a table doesn't have sex, but we still refer to it as a he. why does grammatical gender matter? Why wouldn't we just ignore this weirdly complicated system? One of the things that's cool about it is that it is so complicated. German and Pennsylvania Dutch have it, but English does not have it. So this gives us a cool way to see and maybe better understand what some of the influences of English might be on Pennsylvania Dutch. It can actually also help us understand what the limits of those influences are. So how far can English push the language before it says, no, I'm going to keep my Germanness in this area. The other point is that grammatical gender is very difficult to learn, which if you tried to learn standard German, you'll know this. And really, it's kind of, people have proposed theories for what the function of this would be, like why a language would have a system like this. Because usually if you have a complicated grammatical feature, it gives you expressive power. There's a reason for having it. That's not super clear for grammatical gender. And so maybe it's like, why don't we just shed it? What's it really doing for us? My fifth point is, since a lot of languages closely related to German and Pennsylvania Dutch have lost or reduced their gender systems, which is exactly what happened in English. English used to also have this crazy system and it lost it a couple hundred years ago. We can see that this type of change, referring to losing gender or restructuring it in some way, is actually typical, at least for languages closely related to Pennsylvania Dutch. So that brings me to my questions, both for this lecture and also for my dissertation more broadly. First of all, to what extent do Amish and Mennonite speakers use grammatical gender in a way or the way it historically was used in Pennsylvania Dutch, which we can tell by looking at the grammar books for what Pennsylvania Dutch should be like. I'm also going to look at generational differences, because you would expect if something is changing in the language, then the older speakers are going to do something that's closer to the historical system than the younger speakers. And lastly, what can we learn about the influence of English on Pennsylvania Dutch by studying what is going on with grammatical gender? So I want to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between Amish and Mennonite Pennsylvania Dutch before I get into the nitty-gritty details of my study. First of all, there's a lot of them. They are closely related Anabaptist groups. They both speak English and Pennsylvania Dutch really well. They're proficient bilinguals. They both use English and Pennsylvania Dutch in well-defined domains. So what I mean by that is that they tend to speak Pennsylvania Dutch with other insiders and in the home, whereas they speak English with outsiders and maybe at work or out in the world, wherever. They both usually learn Pennsylvania Dutch first and then learn English sometime around school age. And they both use High German texts for church services, Bible reading, and things like that. There are also some differences, which I already had a sense of before I started this project, but it's only been confirmed in doing this project. Pretty much every Old Order Mennonite would tell me we use Pennsylvania Dutch when we're talking to other Mennonites. We use Pennsylvania Dutch when we're at home. They're pretty consistent about that. There are certainly Amish for whom that's true, Lancaster Amish for whom that's true, but it is not true to the same extent. There are lots of Amish who will admit, I do actually speak a lot of English with other Amish people. I do actually speak a lot of English at home these days. And so there seems to be this growing difference between the Old Order Mennonites and the Amish of Lancaster. And I want to emphasize, I'm talking only about the Amish of Lancaster. It could be completely, I think it is different in the Midwest and in other Amish communities, at least some of them. So the domains of where you're speaking Pennsylvania Dutch and where you're speaking English are much stricter for the Mennonites still, whereas for the Amish, that's becoming a little bit more fluid. So how does that impact the language? I just also want to note, because I do have 2 Weaverland Conference Mennonite participants, this group does use mostly English, the Horning Mennonites. So what I said about the Mennonites does not necessarily, it doesn't apply to them, at least not most of them. So that brings me to my predictions for the study, which is 1, both the Old Order Mennonites and Amish of Lancaster use grammatical gender in a way that does not perfectly conform to the historical system, because this kind of change is common. We see it in other related varieties. And 2, because Amish Pennsylvania Dutch speakers have more intense contact with English, the Amish are further away from the historical system than the Mennonites. So recognizing that English can kind of catalyze, at least, if not cause, this movement away from Germanness in this sense. So this is the structure of my dissertation study. I start with a language background questionnaire, move on to a production task where participants translate 96 phrases from English to Pennsylvania Dutch. And those 96 phrases are using these 32 noun adjective pairs, 8 for each gender, masculine, neuter, and feminine, and 8 for plural. And then they also judge for each of these nouns, these 32 nouns, would you say de, or s? Those are the different gendered ways of saying the. And for some of these nouns, a subset of these nouns, they also say if they would, which adjective ending they would use. So the adjective endings also are gendered. So for gle, which means small, you would use glena if it's masculine, glene if it's feminine, and just gle if it's neuter. Glene if it's plural as well. And then we have the gendered pronouns. So for these 3 tasks, they're basically given something and they're told to pick. And then what this does is this lets me compare what they say when they're translating to what they think they would say or what they think is right when they're judging. And then all these responses are compared against what the historical system is. So right now I have 31 participants, but I'm still counting. So if you know of anyone who would be interested, I am accepting and soliciting people, and would be happy to give out my contact information for that. The average age of the participants that I have so far is 50, and they range from 22 to 90 years old. I have 18 females and 13 males, 17 Old Order Amish, 16 are from Lancaster, and 1 is from Perry County. So Perry is kind of like an offshoot of the Lancaster settlement. And I have 14 Old Order Mennonites. Again, 2 of them are Horning Mennonites, and the rest are Joanger Mennonites. 6 from Lancaster, 5 from Berks, and 3 from Union County. So the language background questionnaire, which is what I do first with each participant, is conducted in Pennsylvania Dutch. And it aims to get basic biographical information like how old is the person, where do they live, where are they from? And then I also try to understand their language use. So how often do they use Pennsylvania Dutch versus English? Which one do they prefer, if any? And how different do they use? Are they more likely to use Pennsylvania Dutch at home? Yeah, probably, but how much more likely? Again, there are differences between the Amish and Mennonites here. So this is how I kind of was trying to get at that. So with that, I'll turn to some of my results. This first thing is the definite article judgment task. Definite article is just a fancy way of saying the. So the question here is, can the participants choose the correct gendered article the for each noun? Again, there's 3. There's the for masculine, that's not actually pronounced with an R. S for neuter, and feminine and plural are de. They're the same. So again, for these 32 nouns, each participant would be asked, would you say, for example, for mun, would you say de mun, es mun, or de mun? And that was done. Oh, this is actually playing. Yeah, so they would see the picture, hear the noun, and then say which one they would say with that. So this is the results of that. So what you're seeing here is on the x-axis if they chose de, or s, and then the color coding is for the gender of the noun. And the boxes are around the one that was the expected one, the one that you would expect according to the historical pattern. So what we're seeing is that with masculine, they do really well. Pretty much most masculine nouns, they picked de. For most plural nouns, they picked de. For most feminine nouns, they picked de as well, but that one's not as strong. They were a little bit more likely to pick de for that. And then neuter is where we really see something crazy happening. They're actually more likely to pick de than s, which is the one that we expected. So s seems to be disadvantaged here. This is basically the same, except that I have it split for the Mennonites and the Amish, Mennonites on the left, Amish on the right, just to kind of see if there are any differences. So for the Mennonites, they are pretty likely to choose the historically correct one. Again, they looking pretty good. Feminine is looking pretty good, still not quite as good as plural. Neuter is still not doing as well, although they did pick more S for neuter than duh. I do also want to point out that the Mennonites, I found this out, I didn't actually know this. The Mennonites use blot for leaf, not lop, and blot is feminine, leaf is or lop is neuter. So what's categorized here as neuter should actually be feminine. And so when they said the here, they were choosing the one that made sense for them. But then if we look at the Amish, they do still do pretty well, especially for masculine and plural, but feminine is doing a little bit worse than it did with the Mennonites, and neuter is also, so they're more likely to choose duh for neuter and feminine. Next, we have adjective endings. So can the participants choose the correct gendered adjective ending for each noun? This is a little bit more complicated. I hope you'll stay with me. In phrases that start with a and an, which is just one word in Pennsylvania Dutch and it's not marked for gender, the endings that go on the adjectives need to be marked for gender. So if you have, so again, we have all these different adjective noun pairs. And if we're looking, so if they get this picture of the man, then they would be asked to choose between these three. So would you say en dit heb ich een man, en dit heb ik een man, or en dit heb ik man? And what they should say if they're following the historical pattern is en dit heb ik een man, because that is the masculine ending. For a woman, it would be en shene vrouw, because that's the feminine ending. For neuter, it would be en jongkind, so no ending for neuter. And for plural, it would also be an e, vriendliche leid. That's what we would expect. Now, what do they do?
Dik heb ik een man,
Oh.
en dik heb ik een man, en dik heb ik man.
I forgot I needed to let these play.
Een shena vrouw, een sheni vrouw, een shee vrouw.
There you go. Okay, so here I have it split again for the Mennonites on the left, Amish on the right. The x-axis is which adjective ending they chose. So the Mennonites are again pretty close to historical gender use. So they're using ER, which is what we expect for masculine mostly, A for plural and A for feminine, doing pretty good. There's a little bit more use of the masculine adjective ending for neuter, but overall pretty good. Again, this A here for neuter is problematic because they were judging law when they would actually say die blot. So we can kind of ignore that and not count that as incorrect. The Amish participants are again less close. So they do pretty well again in masculine and plural, but in feminine, you see they have more masculine and also more of no ending. Here they are using masculine for neuter. So it's the same pattern really for both groups. It's just that the Amish are doing it more. All right, now we have a different kind of adjective ending. These are the ones, or actually an absence of an ending in most cases. These are the ones that come after the. So if you remember, the has gender distinctions. It has the, and s. So you actually don't need to mark gender twice. You mark it on the, and then you put no ending with it, according to the historical paradigm for masculine, feminine, and neuter. You do still put an E on for plural. So if you're asked, let me see if this will.
Ik heb ik een man, de dik heb ik een man, de dik heb ik man.
If you're asked to choose between these three, you should choose the one that has no adjective ending. Same for a woman.
De shena vrouw, de sheni vrouw, de shee vrouw.
And same for feminine and for neuter. They should all have no ending, and then the feminine or the plural will get the A. What do they do? Mostly they follow that. The Mennonites are again doing pretty well. So they're using nothing, A, which is what we expected, and nothing. There's some stuff on the edges that isn't expected, but it's still pretty target-like. Again, the Amish are a little bit less close. Same overall pattern. They're, especially for plural, doing really well. Feminine's pretty good, but masculine, they're using a lot of the masculine ending. So they're actually putting an ending where it doesn't belong. It matches, it's masculine, but it wasn't supposed to be there. And we also see some masculine and some feminine here. So they're overusing the endings there. Next, I'll talk about the production or the translation task. So do the participants produce gender marking on articles and adjectives when you ask them to translate sentences or phrases? So again, I gave them 96 phrases using these 32 noun adjective pairs. And they were given, so either, well, all of them were given with a and with the. So stubborn man, the stubborn man, and then some of them with this and that too, which are also gendered, have gender distinctions. So this stubborn man, that stubborn man. And they got this whole list of phrases in succession that they had to translate. So I'm not nearly done with this part of the data analysis because it's very time consuming to write out 96 noun phrases for every single participant. So this is just not finished yet. But what I did do is I took 3 participants from both the Amish and the Mennonites, 1 from each age group. And I did manage to analyze that data. So that's what I'm presenting here. So this is for the articles. So the a and, the this and that. How many times did they give an expected article and how many times did they give an unexpected one? And then how target-like were they, which is basically the number of expected out of the total number that they said. So how much were they doing what we expected according to the historical system? So if we look at the Mennonites, we see that they're pretty target-like. They're 98%, 89%, 95%. The older Amish person is also pretty target-like at 91%, but the 2 younger speakers are not doing as well at 62 and 70%. Still not terrible. They're not just doing everything different. They're still following the system more than half the time. And the times that they're not following the system is also not random, I would argue. They're still doing something meaningful, but there's some flexibility there in what they can do. If we compare that with, this is the target likeness from the judgment task that I showed you earlier, it's pretty comparable. So we've got the Mennonites doing 91, 81, 97%. It's roughly the same. The older Amish person is at 94%, again, pretty comparable to the production. And then the 2 younger speakers are again worse than everyone else at 53% and 28%, actually worse in judgment than they were in just talking. Worse when they had to choose which one was right. And then looking at the adjectives, it's very similar. We have the same 3 or the same 6 speakers, but the categories are a little bit more complicated. This is if the adjective ending was expected. Incongruent means the gender didn't match. They used a gender marking that didn't match the noun. Overmarking is if they used an adjective ending when none was expected, and undermarking was when they didn't use one when one was expected. So these 3 categories are basically mistakes, if you will, or not target-like. And then we have target-likeness again. So the Mennonites productions are, again, pretty target-like. So we've got 97, 93, and actually our youngest speaker did the best, 99%. So we're not seeing younger speakers start to do worse, like we are with the Amish, where we have the older speaker do really well again, but the younger speakers are at about 50% in target-likeness. But again, I do want to say they're still, even the younger speakers are still doing a lot of things according to the system, over 50%. And then for judgment, we have, again, for the Mennonites, 97, 97, and 94% really well, 97% for the older Amish person, and then 59 and 81% for the 2 younger Amish people. So actually a little bit better with the adjectives than with the articles. The last thing that I'm going to present today, hopefully you're still with me, is the pronoun rating task. So this is to try to answer the question, do the participants prefer the pronoun that marks grammatical gender, which is the historical way of doing it, or do they prefer what English does, which is mark natural gender and use he and she only for things that are alive and it for everything else? So to do this, I picked the subset of the same nouns that I used for the other things. 18 in total, 6 each for masculine, feminine, and neuter. And then each noun was referred to in a little context by each gendered pronoun, he, she, and it. So for man, for example, it would be referred to one time as he, one time as she, and one time as it. An example of a scenario here is, I think I have it, I'll play it for you. But basically the participants would see this picture and then they would hear audio in Pennsylvania Dutch.
Was is kind do?
So what is the child doing?
She is huilen.
She is crying. And then they would be asked to rate this pronoun on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is really good, or 1 is really bad, sorry, and 5 is really good. How good that sounds to them as it refers to the whatever's pictured here. So these are the results of that. We have the humans in the first row, large animals in the second, small animals in the third, so living things on the top 3, and then inanimate objects on the bottom 3. We've got masculine nouns on the left, feminine nouns in the middle, and neuter nouns on the right. And then on the x-axis, we're looking at if the pronoun that was used, or which pronoun was used to refer to the noun. On the y-axis is their rating between 1 to 5, how good or bad they thought that sounded. 1 is bad and 5 is good. So I'm going to show you, hopefully you can see the graphs split up for the Mennonites on the top and the Amish on the bottom. This is a lot going on, I know. Hopefully we can make some sense of it. If we look at the humans, which is the top row, we see that the Mennonite and Amish responses are pretty much the same. He is the best for man. That's not surprising. She is the best for woman. And he is the best for child. If you remember, it was a male child that was depicted. It is actually the expected one for neuter. And that one's doing pretty well too, but he is better. And it's the same for man. It's the same for the Amish. He is best for man. She is best for woman. He is best for child, but it's okay too. If we look at the animals, we see that all 3 pronouns are acceptable for most speakers. We can see that best with the Amish. So he, she, and it are okay for dog. Same for cat, sheep. I can't read that from here. Oh my goodness. Worm, now fly, and mouse. So all 3 of those are fine. The Mennonites have pretty much the same thing going on for the animals. And that kind of speaks to the fact that if it's an animal, you don't know if it's male or female. It doesn't really matter if it's a he, she, or an it, right? It could be any of those. But the Mennonites actually show more sensitivity to grammatical gender here than the Amish. For example, with dog, where he would be the grammatically correct one, they clearly prefer that over she and it. So they have the same pattern, but they show more sensitivity to grammatical gender. And that's pretty much what we see with the inanimate objects as well, the last 3 rows. So both groups do allow it. And this is, so because it is expected for neuter, this column is actually not very interesting. But if we look at the columns where he or she is expected for an inanimate object, we see that both the Mennonites here, it is high, it is high, it's high, high, high. It is acceptable for all of these objects, even though the correct answer would be he or she. And the same is true for the Amish. We do see, though, that there's sensitivity to grammatical gender in that if you have fork, for example, where it's historically she is way better than he. And so both groups are showing that, but the Mennonites are, again, a little bit more sensitive to that distinction. So, for example, here with plate, they're showing a big preference for he over she. When I did this task with Standard German speakers, if you speak Standard German, this probably won't surprise you. They clearly preferred the grammatically correct pronoun and did not like it for something like plate. That had to be he. And so there is definitely something going on in Pennsylvania Dutch in both groups in terms of allowing this to become more English-like rather than staying really true to the grammatical gender. So in summary, pronouns in both groups are being used more like they are in English at the expense of grammatical gender. So trees can be referred to as it, at least some of the time, instead of he, and vice versa for child. So you can call a child a he or a she instead of always calling it an it. So what this means is that biological sex and animacy is if something's alive or not, do matter in addition to grammatical gender when deciding which pronoun to use. This is something I haven't noted throughout the presentation, but I just wanted to make a note of it now. Mennonite and some older Amish speakers still produce a clear distinction between the and de, these words for the, masculine and feminine, but younger Amish speakers tend not to. And that's actually one of the ways that I got stuck on this topic, is because I was like, I say the for everything. I don't say the and the. But you can still find it, especially with older speakers. So just to note that, that definitely was confirmed as I did my interviews with Amish and Mennonites. Also, both Mennonite and Amish speakers are producing the, where S was historically the correct form of the article the. Not just, but it's definitely it seems to be increasing. They're both doing that. The Amish are doing it more. Both Mennonite and Amish speakers did not complete the judgment tasks for articles and adjectives in perfect accordance to the historical system. So they're both doing things that are not exactly what the textbooks say they should be doing. But the Mennonites are more closely aligning themselves with the textbooks, shall we say, or with expectations, whereas the Amish are a little bit further off from that. I think it's also interesting to note that plural marking was really consistent in both groups. So they're both still doing this. So de and the adjective ending, especially the adjective ending e, were more likely to be produced and chosen than the feminine de and e. So they're more likely to make a singular plural distinction than to make a feminine masculine distinction. So this is proof that Pennsylvania Dutch is just a broken mishmash, right? It's just doing whatever it wants. No, that might not surprise you that that's my answer now. The grammatical gender system does seem to be getting more like English, yes, generally. And this does seem to be more advanced in groups that use English more. But if we look at other languages, as I've already mentioned, these types of changes are typical, or at least not unusual. This is, like I've mentioned before, exactly what happened in English hundreds of years ago. And not all the changes that I've discussed or that we see are in the direction of English. They're not all just, okay, let's be like English. For example, the adjectives are doing their own thing. If they were becoming like English, they would be getting lost. They'd be dropping off and we wouldn't be using adjective endings anymore. But actually what we saw is that sometimes they're using adjective endings where they're not supposed to be using them, or where we didn't expect them. So that they're not just disappearing, they're just using them in a different way or according to different rules. Even though all this inconsistency can look disorderly and be confusing, all it really means is that the language is reshaping its grammar rules, which is a very normal thing for languages to do. So often if more than one thing is possible or sounds okay, that's an indication that something is changing in the grammar. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means the language is changing as languages do. On the other hand, if we look at plural marking on adjectives with e, we see a perfect example of a very consistent grammar rule. So I think my Pennsylvania Dutch speaking friends will agree that you can't say die freundlich leid. You have to say die freundliche leid. You need that adjective ending or it sounds wrong. So the Amish and the Mennonite participants were very consistent about using that and picking that one, as we saw. And lastly, speakers of all languages, including Pennsylvania Dutch, don't speak randomly most of the time. Language is not random most of the time. Utterances are systematic and rule governed. And so I hope that even though I showed you something that's changing and looking kind of funky, I hope that I also convinced you that language use is constricted. You can't just do whatever you want and be understood. Even their mistakes are usually reveal some linguistic tendency. So we can actually learn a lot by listening to the mistakes that people make. So I spent all this time defending Pennsylvania Dutch that looks more English than it used to. But I do want to also end on a word of caution to all my Pennsylvania Dutch speaking friends, where Pennsylvania Dutch is spoken less, it is at greater loss of being fully replaced by English. So my friends, if you care about Pennsylvania Dutch, speak it, which I need to say to myself as well. I would like to end by acknowledging the Young Center. Thank you very much for hosting me and making this research possible. Thank you to my research assistant, Marie, whose help with this project has made it possible for me to present all of this data tonight. And thank you very, very much to each participant who generously gave their time and energy, opened their hearts and their doors to me, and helped me learn so much about them and their communities. Thank you very much for listening. I do also have some references on the next slide, but they're not very exciting. I think this cute picture is better. I think the next part, how much time do we have?
We have 15 minutes for questions, and you can, if you have questions, please repeat them into the microphone. But
Okay, yeah, so if anyone has any questions.
So I know you said that, well, my question is like, when the Amish or the Mennonites speak in Pennsylvania Dutch or English, do they like rotate through it in the sentence? You know what I mean? Like they use both languages in one or a couple sentences? Or do they like strictly speak Pennsylvania Dutch and then English like different at a different time? You know?
Great question. Yeah, so the question was, do Amish and, you said Amish and Mennonite speakers, right?
Yeah.
Do they use English and Pennsylvania Dutch in a single sentence? Do they switch between them when they're having a conversation, or do they stick with one and then use the other? From personal experience, I can say absolutely the Amish codes, it's called code switching, where you switch from English to Pennsylvania Dutch or back again. Absolutely, they code switch all the time. Lots of speakers do that. I maybe shouldn't say everyone, but lots of speakers do, or they definitely insert English words, but even just like a whole sentence or a paragraph and then switch back all the time. I have not spent as much time around Mennonites. There might be other people who can answer. Yeah. Would you say that they do that a lot?
Do that some,
Okay.
as you know, we speak of the sentence in Pennsylvania Dutch and the other part in English, or part of the paragraph, or if we want to imitate somebody, we will use the English language.
Sure.
Spoken in English, what do you say? I agree with that.
So some, but my sense would be less. I think they stay in Pennsylvania Dutch a little bit more.
When I get home from work, people ask me, how can I shift from English to Pennsylvania Dutch as soon as I'm inside the door? Well, that part is automatic. You don't need to think twice from shifting from one language to the next. Just your own. You leave the English outside the door and you come to speak Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yep. And that's part of being a bilingual, is you're used to just switching from one to the other. Yeah.
There's a lot to absorb, but I think what I heard was that there's a tendency for the pronouns to drift towards the English use of gender, but that for the definite articles, there's a tendency for neuter to drop and become feminine or masculine, or masculine, which led me to believe that maybe the neuter is dying out, but then that's countered by the fact that when you come to the strong affirmative endings, the neuter ending is still being used historically correctly. Is there a reason why the definite article, the neuter is dying out, but for the strong adjective endings, it's still staying in? I guess was that a correct observation? And do you have an answer?
Yeah. Do I need to repeat that? First of all, I'm really impressed. You understood perfectly. Yes, very well said. I don't know if there's that's actually something we've been wondering too, is why is it doing so well on the adjectives and doing so bad on the articles? I don't know. Also because S, it really sticks out. Like you can hear it. There's no way for you to be like S and hear duh unless you're expecting duh. So it's strange that that would get lost, but that does seem to be what's happening. And I don't really know why, except maybe, well, neuter is the least common gender. So it just doesn't happen as often. But why it would still stick with the adjectives, that's kind of a mystery at this point. That's a very good question. Yeah.
Your statistics had the groupings of the Amish and then the Mennonites. And I wanted to go over to the Amish. And in those statistics, you chose a male for your older group. You had a female for the middle age group, and you had another male as your younger person. And it appeared that the woman was coming through with the lower scores, percentages on most of those, as I remember seeing them. So my question is there in some environment that's causing these results to produce what you're getting, such as I would think the men are more out into the public, maybe more, than the lady would be. So I guess my question is, have you thought about the environment that would cause some of these results?
That's a really good question. You're right. I do actually, one of the reasons that I want to include males and females is because a lot of linguists have shown that they do use language differently. And certainly in this case, the men are more likely to use more English than the women who are staying home and speaking to the children and things like that. So I would actually, if my hypothesis holds, I would expect the women to speak more Pennsylvania Dutch and to speak it more conservatively and have fewer mistakes, if you will, than the men, which I think with 6 people and certainly 2 people who are, it's just not enough of people. I need to analyze the rest of my data, but I'm definitely keeping that in mind. Yeah, Don.
My question, first of all, thank you for a really excellent presentation. It was really well done. It follows Carol's question a little bit, and that is the social context and the economy that these 2 different groups, the Joe Wanger horse and buggy driving groups, and the Amish have a very different economy underlying them. The horse and buggy over Mennonites are very much still agricultural. Okay, and the Amish are very much into small businesses. A lot of interaction with the outside world because of that. And so my question is, I guess, inviting you to think more about the economy underlying these 2 very different groups and how that might impact their language.
I should have mentioned that. You're absolutely right. That I think that's absolutely playing a role in why the Mennonites are able to kind of keep Pennsylvania Dutch more in the home and not letting English kind of encroach on those spaces quite as much. I think it's very hard when you are speaking English all day at work, and that might even be at home on your farm, to not bring that into the house is very hard. So I think it's absolutely an important factor. Yeah.
Based on what you just talked about, my understanding or my belief for years would have been that the Midwest Amish were much more historically Pennsylvania Dutch speaking than Lancaster Amish. Have you done any research on that at all?
So I guess I will repeat the question now. I just remembered I'm supposed to be doing that. The question was, have I considered if the Midwestern Amish are different? Did I get that right? Different than the Lancaster Amish?
Historically more Pennsylvania Dutch speaking.
Yeah. So I've looked at other research on that. There's other people who've looked at that, but I haven't actually done any research. The research that other people have done, I think, does indicate that they are more conservative, I guess, linguistically conservative, not quite as influenced by English. And it might be for the same reasons that Don was mentioning, that even their workspaces are not as likely to be completely English, they're more likely to kind of keep Pennsylvania Dutch amongst themselves and not be using quite as much English. And so I think that's part of it. But I want to learn more. I want to go to the Midwest someday. Yeah.
Taking German 50 years ago in college, I was wondering, where does their DDoS come from, male, female, neuter? Where does that come from in the language and why do they use it? They're always confusing.
It's always confused me too. So
Just the question briefly.
Oh yeah, sorry. So the question is, where does this gender distinction even come from originally? This daddy das, how did that happen? So it's a little hard to tell because that's been around for longer than the languages that we even have really good records for. So we only know some things about the language that even came from. But the theory is that it originally did mean something like what English does, where you could put it into a category that made sense, like alive and not alive. And it went with that. And a lot of gender systems in the world's languages do that. They go into categories that make sense. And then it just kind of devolved into something that was grammatical and didn't connect anymore to a clear category. That's the theory. My understanding is that people don't really know for sure.
The reason I asked is, my wife and I living in Vietnam, and Vietnam is a simple language. I was teaching English as a second language. And what I found was over there, they use male, female, older, younger when they're talking to friends. So there's not one you, like in English, you say you and that covers everybody. So for example, I would say, Xin Chao, hello, to a woman I was working with. And I said, oh, I learned some new words today. I said, Xin Chao, Chi Han, her name was Han. And she, unfortunately, means older sister. So she heard me calling her grandmother.
Ooh.
She got mad at me and started whacking me on the shoulder. You cannot use that, you're older than me. And she was highly insulted. So that's where you get in trouble with language.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing was you were talking about speaking more English and how it becomes corrupted or, using more English and less Pennsylvania Dutch. I had a student living with us when she was 18 from Frankfurt, and then she came back a couple of years ago to visit, and I said, oh, I'm going to take you to Roots Market, and you can talk to the Amish, right? She was thrilled. So she went there, and she goes up to an old guy, long beard, and old timer, and buying some cookies at Roots Market. And she's talking to him in high German, modern German. And he just looked at her like, what language he was speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't get what she was saying at all. And she was speaking high German to her. And he refused to speak back to her in German or Pennsylvania Dutch. And she was really disappointed.
Oh.
It was just funny. So I didn't know. And actually later I said, I said, this is my German student, I'm Frankfurt, did you talk to her? And he said to me, what language was she speaking? So I think the dialect through is my guess.
Yeah, I think that further demonstrates my point that they really are different. That you can find commonalities for sure, but often just speaking on the fly is tricky. Yeah.
Informal.
Yeah.
Language.
Yeah.
After watching presentation, I understand that better. And thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
When I lived in Germany, it was near D and DOS. When did the D disappear from DOS?
So the question was, why is there no D in das in Pennsylvania Dutch? It's S, not das. I would argue it never was in Pennsylvania Dutch because they didn't speak standard German. They spoke Palatinate German and other varieties of German, which also have S instead of das. So I guess you could probably say historically the D was there a long, long time ago, but certainly that didn't get lost here in the US. That got lost already in Germany, which is true of a lot of features of Pennsylvania Dutch that are different than standard German.
I guess when I was learning English in elementary school, it's like a proper way to speak and then like a grammatically correct way to speak. So if I say, I don't got no cookies, like I don't have any cookies. Does that same concept apply to Pennsylvania Dutch, or is that like where it's almost like a slang way to speak, and then how do you incorporate that to study?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so he was referring back to the example about the double negatives and then asking and saying there's a grammatically correct way to speak English, and then there's kind of slang. Does Pennsylvania Dutch have something like that? I would say there's definitely, I'm sure that there's some slang things that, every generation will have their own way of saying things, but I don't think it has quite the same thing in the sense that there's nobody for Pennsylvania Dutch saying, this is the right way to say Pennsylvania Dutch, and all these things are written down and everyone's reading the rules and saying, okay, can't use a double negative. It just isn't really a thing for Pennsylvania Dutch. And so it doesn't have that rule breaking in the same way. Yeah. Yes.
Do they teach school in English or Pennsylvania Dutch?
Good question. Do they teach school in English or Pennsylvania Dutch? That's in English. So sometimes I think they might speak Pennsylvania Dutch on the playground, but usually it's English. The school day is in English because it's important for the children to also learn to speak English. Mm-hmm.
Actually, so related to that, and a question to the question about Midwest. Are you familiar? Is anyone here familiar with Amish or Mennonite schools here in Lancaster that actually have a penalty for kids speaking English on the playground. So in northern Indiana, if you speak in an Amish school, if you speak English on the playground, you usually have to sit out for 5 minutes of whatever game you're playing.
I didn't know that.
Pennsylvania, I said that wrong. If you speak.
Oh, okay, okay.
You have to sit out. I didn't know if that was
Oh, go ahead, Lydia.
Yeah, that does happen here because they want them to learn to speak English fluently. And if they only speak English in class, go out and play, it becomes Pennsylvania Dutch that gets lost. You know, they can't speak fluently in English if they only speak Pennsylvania Dutch in the playground. So some schools, if you're in school, you're English. However, they usually have sessions in German as well, where they teach them the German language phonetically and all that. And then they might speak German, Pennsylvania Dutch in that class, but then that would be an individual class. But mostly they will require them to speak English on the playground.
And my answer would be, I don't know of any schools that still, I know that historically they did that, but I don't know of any schools that still punish the use of English. Like if children use Pennsylvania Dutch on the playground, they get punished for it. I don't know of any schools that do that. That doesn't mean there aren't any.
It's just reminders.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Going back to the German language, when we were in Zurich, Switzerland, the German that I would have learned in school that she talked about, I learned German, which basically the Amish can preach as best they can. I could not read the German road signs. I couldn't hardly read any German going through the country. But when we got the old church or the Reformation started, all the signs were in the German that I was taught in school. Can you explain that difference?
Sorry, one more time. Where could you understand it?
If you remember, we were reading the signs and you were so amazed I could read the signs in the old church where the Reformation started in Zurich, Switzerland. Whereas I couldn't read the signs as soon as we got outside of that building.
Yeah. So
what is the difference? What was the difference in how those signs in that old church was the same German that I was taught in our Amish school? But what is the difference in that and today's German language?
Yeah. So the question was, why could he, as someone who grew up with Amish German, understand the writing on the church in the church and not out, on signs? And the answer is because the old German that the Amish and Mennonites still use has an old script. And that's what used to be all German, but modern German uses the same alphabet that we do. So they use the same script that we do. And so when you read a sign, it's all the same letters that we use for English, just spelling German words. But when you read the script in the church, it's the old German script. That's why you can read that better, because you're used to reading that in religious texts that you grew up with.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we need to wrap our time this evening, but I wanted to once again thank Rose for being here this semester and for this presentation, which was fascinating. And thanks to all of you for being here. 2 announcements before we close. First, the photography exhibit Before Baptism, featuring the photos of Amish children by photographer Gail Noggle and Ellen Sabin, which is on view in Zug Hall across campus, was scheduled to come down the end of this week, but has been extended by a week. So you can still see those images through Friday, April 12. If you haven't, or if you want to go back and see them again, the gallery is open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Saturdays and Sundays from 1 to 5 in the afternoon. And then second, as we look ahead here at the Young Center to next fall, our first event, come back and join us September 19th, 7 p.m. for a presentation by Nancy Bieber, who will be sharing about her grandmother, Fianna Bucher Meyer, a tragic story in many ways, death of her grandmother at a very young age 28, of tuberculosis, but a fascinating story of Nancy reconstructing the life of her grandmother from archival fragments, clothing, letters, bits and pieces of information that in recent years she has been able to reconstruct the life of a grandmother, actually a woman that her own father barely knew because she had died so soon after Nancy's father was born. So it's a local story, a story with connections to this area, Elizabethtown, Lebanon County, Southern Lancaster County, and also just an interesting story of reconstructing the life of someone from the archival fragments that have been left. We have other events planned for next fall, including a performance by the Ephrata Cloister Chorus and a presentation from our Snowden Fellow on the Brethren in Christ denomination and its relationship to American evangelicalism in the 20th century. Special thanks this evening to support staff from Information Technology Services here at Elizabethtown College and to Elizabethtown College for making this program possible and for its support of the Young Center. Again, thank you all for being here and safe travels as you return home.